setup and then to arguments. Let's begin with setup. What's our model? Very simply, this will happen in all democracy. Notice that there's a varying range of democracies. It can include strong and weak democracies too. Second of all, this would apply to all immediate members. For example, children, parents, siblings, partners. Like the difference between a boyfriend and a husband isn't that, like there's no real difference there. We would have like aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, grandparents, and grandchildren too. But thirdly, for people that are presently in office, like they'll be allowed to like continue until the end of their term, but come the next term, they wouldn't be allowed to run for office anymore. Let's begin with our arguments then. Two arguments in this speech. My first argument will explain why these candidates are voted in irrespective of whether or not they are good or bad. There are three reasons for why this is true. Firstly, oftentimes having a family named means that you are known in various constituencies. And note that because of a lack of voter engagement, there exists a vast pool of voters that vote for someone just because they know who they are, just because they're familiar with that family name. For example, George W. Bush being elected in the primaries, despite not being the best possible candidate, because he had his father in office before, in the past before, that explains that there. But second of all, oftentimes I'd explain that family names obscures bad things and policy you've done in the past before, because you can point to the legacy and the rich history and the traditions and the contributions that your family has brought to the nation, and accordingly you can choose that to obscure that there. But thirdly, I would explain, and this is crucial, that politicians, like the old politicians, have vast amounts of control over how these primaries occur. Why is this true? Firstly, they often control the appointments because they have very big standing in the party. They control the appointments of directors who oversee how these primary elections happen in the first instance. That is, if you're a very successful politician, you have a lot of roots and connections within your party, you can do that there. But second of all, even if that isn't true, they control a lot of the discourse. For example, after Trump's final term, if he was to step down and strongly endorse someone else, if it was a family member, that would be very strong there. But thirdly, oftentimes they have friendships there, they have friendships with people that they're in office with, or that they have worked with in the tenure of their political appointment, and they can get deals under the table to get these candidates through in their primaries. But I would explain here, why would they not do this for someone who is not their family? There are two reasons why this is true. Firstly, oftentimes there exists a risk in intervening in the politics, like you get backlash and you're exposed to backlash there. But second of all, I would say that people are hesitant to assist in the legacies of people after they've come, because that crowds out their own legacy. For example, if you're the governor of an area, if you were to assist with the legacy of your next person after you retire from politics, that crowds out your achievement, and politicians care about their legacy there. The upshot of this argument is that the upshot of this mechanism is that these old politicians have huge amounts of controls over how the primary operates, the candidates that are allowed to go here in the first instance, and they can pick who will be running in the first place in very, very bad ways. And this is bad for three reasons. Firstly, the pool of candidates becomes far worse for two reasons. Firstly, they're just not picked in the first place, the best possible candidate isn't picked. But second of all, I would say there is a chilling effect. When people become aware of this, when new politicians that enter the fray hear these stories from other people, they become unwilling to run in that district where a relative of someone else is getting the handle. But second of all, I will explain that this is principally bad because it artificially stops new people from coming into the fore. And the reason why our principled harm might outweigh the principled harm that side negative might oppose is because their principled harm applies to the person or the singular person or the one or two people that are the relative members, whereas our principal harm is to a vast pool of people that would have been willing to run in these seats in the first place, but that are artificially stopped from doing this from the get-go, which explains we have a principled harm, and that principled harm outweighs the one that side negative might have. But thirdly, that also means that district gets worse outcomes. For example, George Wallace was a very famous anti-civil rights senator in Alabama. After he left power, he got his wife to run for office, who had that name power. She got in, and he ruled via proxy to her. She ran a lot of the old policies that he ran in the past before. And that means that those districts get far worse outcomes, and that is particularly bad. My second argument will explain why these politicians and the policies that they have are particularly bad. Firstly, Why are their policies bad? Firstly, I think that they are likely to rely on old policies and they do old things and be like, this is what my father did, this is what my mother did, this was our legacy and I will continue to bring that to the state. This looks like, for example, George W. Bush continuing the war, like doing the war on terror, because his father engaged in like military operations all over the world. For example, regressive tax policies that are particularly bad and justified by saying, this is my family's ways, this is how we've done things. What I'm doing is that oftentimes people are punished from veering away from old policies that they've done in the past before. Because if you do that, you lose association with the name that benefited you in the first place. Explain why that's unlikely to happen there. But second of all, your family name can often shield you from bad policy outcomes or decisions that you make, because you can point to the legacy of your family there. But thirdly, I would say that you can get coordination between family members that is particularly bad. For example, when you for example, if you're both elected, you can do things to ensure that each other are well off or politically well off. For example, Maurice Payne is a federal health minister. She pushed for a hospital to be built in Penrith because that's where her partner is running for a political seat. Stuff like that, coordination between family members that are running between office can happen. And that has very bad policy outcomes. This policy is unrepresentative. And it's unclear whether or not progressive policy or conservative policy is good or bad. But what you should principally care about is representative policy that is representative of the people's interests. But fourthly, I would explain that you can get around, and this is crucial, this often acts as a means for informally getting around term limits or democratic limitations. For example, after a person has served a term limit, I've given the example of George Wallace, but look at examples of I think it's Bongbong Marcos continuing to rule after the Marcos family, and I think it was Melda Marcos, and doing stuff like that, which is incredibly bad. And they can do stuff like continuing bad. They can do stuff like continuing bad policies there, and that is particularly important because these policies affect people's lives. This is incredibly important and outweighs any harm that the other will have. But secondly, the second part of this argument will explain why these politicians themselves are quite bad compared to other politicians that would have otherwise alternatively run. Firstly, oftentimes they could just be incompetent. They didn't do grassroots stuff like the first member of their family did. They don't know how to make deals behind the walls of parliament. And obviously side negative might say, well, they might learn it from their family members, but this is symmetric. People that engage in politics can do this. People with older experience in politics, which aren't necessarily always these people, are far better at doing this. But second of all, I would say that politicians are quite bad because now they have incentives to hide the bad parts. They have the capacity to hide the bad parts of their legacy. For example, Bongbong Marcos doing that, hiding the bad parts of his parents' bad parts of his parents' policies, or bad parts of his parents' policies over there. But thirdly, I would explain that you get a chilling effect that sort of chills the amount of people that are willing to go into office in these districts in the first place. And that's particularly bad because it vastly narrows the pool of candidates that you potentially have. And I think in the worst context, in democracies where when democracies are quite weak, where there's not that much voter engagement, where people are disillusioned with voting in the first place, they vote for family members on family names. You get worse outcomes, proud to affirm.
To adjudicate this debate, you need no look further than the 2016 election. In a world where Trump was elected over Clinton, and where Clinton faced a huge amount of scrutiny and endless comparison to her husband, in that debate, this politician did suffer an even greater amount of scrutiny because of their relationships to politicians. Firstly, on the principle of democracy, Side negative has a simple claim, which is just, if people vote for them, that is okay. We allow people to make imperfect and stupid political decisions all the time. For instance, we allow people to vote with imperfect reasons and imperfect knowledge. But secondly, we would posit that people are very well informed about this particular change because, one, it's obvious they have the same last name, but secondly, this candidate themselves have an incentive to campaign on this base, to say, hey, I am legitimate because I am the son or daughter of this person, people do know about this change. But secondly, we'd explain that other actors also have an incentive to police them on it. So for instance, the opposing candidate would say, well, this candidate is illegitimate, they're just a nepo baby. So obviously people have access to this information and are able to make this decision. We would explain that democracy is incredibly important, and this side affirmative is arbitrarily restricting the democratic options that people have available to them. No, this is irrespective of whether this is a good or bad candidate. We would explain that people make shit decisions all the time. It is unclear why this specific change is a uniquely bad decision that people make in their voting calculus. But importantly, you ought let people exercise their democratic votes to an even greater extent, because democracy is incredibly important. That government has control over their taxes, their policy, and it has a monopoly of violence over those people. To the extent that side negative gives them a greater degree of ability and to enact their democratic freedoms, you all prefer this. But secondly, we would explain that these people didn't consent to being in those families, so you should all let them run as candidates, because they did not consent to being married. They did not consent to be born to the son or whatever of a huge politician. So principally, you ought to support this. Secondly, why do these candidates get more scrutiny and make them better candidates than on-side affirmative? We would explain that before election cycles, this is a very visible and very easy critique to make, because aside from having to make policy decisions, these media sources and competing parties can just point to the fact that they are very low-hanging fruit, that they are just a nepo baby. But for instance, they are likely to ask questions like, how do you compare to, what can you do additionally to your predecessor? Are you just a nepo baby? Are you legitimate here? We'd explain that this makes them do two things. Firstly, they have to justify why they are a valid candidate in the first place. It would explain that other parties and the media have an incentive to ask what is good about them. But secondly, we would explain that the term nepo baby increasingly in society is a very demeaning term. We explain that these people have a huge an additional burden to prove that they are legitimate candidates. But secondly, they have to justify why they are a better candidate, because this is a direct and obvious comparison that these people can make, comparison that they can to their predecessors. So they have to explain why they are better than those administrations that come before them. But additionally, their claim is they would just use the same policies all the time. But obviously these politicians aren't stupid. They can be judicious with how they weaponize the narratives of their forefathers or whatever. For instance, yeah, you guys really liked my dad's economic policy when he did that. I'm going to do the same thing. But that candidate could just as easily say, you guys hated when my dad did this, and I fucking hate my dad, so I'm going to do the complete opposite of my dad. It's so unclear why these politicians are necessarily bound to what their parents are doing. Obviously, if they're being compared to other family members, that gives the media narratives to directly compare them and give those people an explanation as to why they are a better candidate, why they are a legitimate candidate. So, secondly, we would next, we explain that during the campaign, we would just explain that the amount of your ability to check this candidate specifically for corruption is just far higher. Because if there were families of previous administrations, those administrations have a huge amount of records, and those previous media cycles have an incentive to police those former administrations, which means that the amount of dirt that can possibly be collected on this candidate is just far higher in comparison to a new candidate that no one has ever heard before. So, to the extent which you're able to police the amount, how corrupt these politicians can be, obviously our candidates there's a lot more dirt and a lot more information that you could possibly dig up on them, which means their capacity to be corrupt is just far less on our side. So, after the election then, these people are always looking at these people for signs of corruption, because for the reasons that they identify, having a political dynasty is unpopular, being an baby is unpopular, so we would explain that the amount of surveillance that these candidates get in specific is just dialed up to 11. But secondly, we would explain that what is the impact of this then? We explain that these candidates that we explain are easier to hold accountable than on their side, but the incentive for these candidates and other candidates to hold them accountable is just greater. They have an incentive to promise more, to try harder, to improve upon the legacy of their fathers. Not only because they need to justify their existence, but they themselves have a legacy incentive to show that they are different than their fathers, that they're not just riding on their coattails. But finally, we would explain that in the case of imperfect democracies, it's so unclear why these politicians can't just endorse other candidates. Because their claim is that, these leaders have controls over primaries and they control discourse and under the table tactics. None of that is specific to having the same last name as your dad. Their next claim is that, you don't want to interfere. That is, again, not specific to having the same last name. Their only, their only claim that is unique to having the last name is that you can't, if you support a candidate that isn't related to you, they can usurp your legacy. But surely that is just comparatively more true when that's your son. Your son has usurped you. They have directly usurped you. Whereas on the comparative, they can just carry your policies throughout. The previous administration's policies I'm going to carry, whereas that son has an incentive to differentiate themselves and break from your legacy. So to the extent that you're able to, like, leaders and former leaders can co-opt the legacies of new candidates, obviously their capacity to do that is far greater on when a candidate doesn't have an incentive to, or an even greater incentive to differentiate themselves. So for those reasons, they never explain why they, like, most of their mechanisms are not specific to these candidates having the same last name as the old leader or whatever. Last argument then is to explain why you just lose a ton of talent that is extraordinarily important, and why these candidates are especially good. Because we explain that these candidates specifically are given unique work opportunities that lets them, like, that makes them be better candidates. Because it's not like your dad telling you and teaching you, like, in your bedroom about foreign policy. Obviously not. A lot of these candidates just do have office experience. That looks like Hillary Clinton being the senator and secretary of state. That looks like other people working in other administrative roles. Those roles are incredibly important and directly, like, I guess, inculcates them in the workings of government. And that is extraordinarily important because now they know how the government works. They know those restrictions and limitations. They know what legislation works, how to communicate between different branches of government, but also just litigate, discourses and, you know, negotiations between different party members and politicians. That is a very important skill that these people uniquely learn once they're in office, which they are likely to when they're inculcated, as I explained. But secondly, they're more likely to, have built connections in their time in office. That looks like trusting your intelligence officers and your army officials so you can work more cohesively. That looks like working and knowing the relationships and the, temperaments of politicians in other countries. And that's extraordinarily important as well. That makes that government work better. That makes your foreign relations even better. And even if this affirmative would say, oh, they're privileged, it's a dynasty, we explain they bring a ton of experience and education given their point of privilege. And we explain that this is especially important in developing states and local councils in disprivileged areas. These areas specifically lack expertise, and otherwise these transitional periods would be relatively really unstable, because being a politician in these areas is an extraordinarily unpopular job. People who typically work in those areas, in those agrarian areas who otherwise aren't specialized, aren't able to transfer and apply to be a politician. They just aren't that many people in law degrees in agrarian areas. We would explain then that in these instances, it's especially important that you have people who are trained in government, who have that expertise that you otherwise would lose. That is important for the functioning of the government. You should vote for Affirmative.
Very weird this team wants to run this debate on you get more choice over when the Dutertes and the Marcoses are the only two choices in literally every Filipino election. It's just one of each side running against each other, and you only get the choice between two different sets of family members. Obviously, that is much worse for people. They can only choose between two elite ruling families that were in many ways just very similar in the policies that they proposed, and you didn't get a real choice. We think that they crowded out the candidates, explained pretty well. We get a more diverse set on our side. The real principle is people should be able to access to vote who they want. We should crowd them out with candidates that are able to beat them every time through the name of their family. First, we'll deal with the principles, then some second substantive, and then third, explaining where you get better quality politicians. Let's first deal with the principle. They say that you have a principal right to run for office. We're going to have three general responses, and then we'll deal with the way the principle's made. First general response is I'd say the way Abrar explains is that you use the fact that you have a partner to circumvent democratic norms. For example, in the 1950s, when there was a term break limit where you cannot govern for too long in Alabama as the governor, George was his wife in place and then governed through her, circumventing things we agreed with democratic norms and would ensure that we would maximize people's choices. This looks like things like when you get impeached and turfed out of office, you get your wife to run, or you get your son to run instead, and then you govern through them. That helps flip the principle because it means people we decided we didn't think were principally legitimate to run for office are still able to do that, and it flips all of that. The second way is I would just say that both sides in some cases support term limits. This is just a different version of a term limit. It's term limiting families rather than specific individuals. And that is able to flip their principle, because I think we need to support term limits for general families and the way they work. I know this is similar to other ways we have term limits for organizations. For example, many countries have term limits for a party can't rule for 40 years. We think that that's principally moral for them to do. It's a similar thing. We have term limits for you to be able to run for your family. That explains how it's principally flipped on our side. The third way we principally flip it is I just say there are a bunch of other restrictions that we believe in, and it's unclear that this one's a bad one. Things like if you are not a permanent resident, you cannot run. I just say you're still affected by the state power principle they give if you're a permanent resident or if you're a felon. Or if you have perverse interests is generally what we're looking at. When there are dual nationals having interest in another country and also this country, under Section 44C of the Australian Constitution, they cannot run. Under other places, generally they cannot run because we have perverse interests. In the same way that if your wife is governing in the state and you are governing federally, we think you have a perverse interest to help her get elected. This is a different version of the same thing, upholding principles that we already have. That explains it. Let's go through the ways that they make this argument. The first thing they say is that you're well informed. This doesn't apply to the other ways we kick people out of running for office. You'd probably be well informed to pick a felon to run for office. We don't allow you to in the vast majority of cases. And also Abrar gives a series of reasons as to why you're not well informed. That wasn't responsive. They say there are other actors that are going to police you, but I often give it the clashes of two different families, the Bushes and the Clintons. It's the clashes of the Dutertes and the Marcoses. Because in context where you can build a hegemon and build power yourself, often two different families are able to build power and come up through the party systems that they develop. That explains that they won't want to hold each other accountable because they both have their power. They won't be like, oh no, the Dutertes are Nepo babies, because like, you're a Nepo baby too as a Marcos. Obviously, you wouldn't run that. They say you didn't consent to being born in that family, but like there are a bunch of, again, these uncomparatively other ways to block you from running for office. You didn't consent to things like being not born in that country, not being a permanent resident. Often it doesn't really matter in those cases. That explains how the way they make the principles not bad, but in the most generous way we give it, we have three general responses to it. They try and say that the primary stuff is not comparative, because you can do it for non-family members, so you would still select people back. I think there's two ways. First way is the preemption that Abrar gives you on this, which is just as a risk towards picking people and over-intervening in your party. And you only do that when you saw a direct benefit of picking your son, or in that direct benefit doesn't have to be to continue your policies, but you like make your son happy is a simple direct benefit to be able to get. It wasn't contingent on the way Ollie tried to make it contingent. But secondly, I would say that even if you're picking other people and you're appointing other people, not your son, that's at least somewhat more democratic, because you're picking like the noble people in your party rather than from your eldest male child. Like that's a more democratic way to pick it, even if it's like choosing from 4 people rather than 1. I say we're still able to flip it on being more democratic than this team picks. The next thing we're going to explain is how having family members in here is able to crowd out other candidates, so it diverts democracy and means we get less democracy. A few ways this is true. The first way is that in most contexts you often need a party, and when we explain that they control the party, there's no norm of independence running, being able to run at a federal level because you need lots of funding. That explains you're able to be crowded out. Secondly, I would say that the initial brand of just like you're guaranteed that some people know you means you're likely to absorb a lot of money from donors because they already know you and they think you're a more certain benefit. Thirdly, I said you often just end up having money for political people who you can talk to and get advice from, to be able to crowd out all the other candidates by talking to them. Fourthly, I think you can just be appointed to take these positions. And fifthly, I think people just often don't want to piss off the ruling family that does have heaps of power, so they wouldn't run against you because they're scared. They'll wait till the next election in 8 years when they think that they can finally run, because they don't want to piss off someone who's so powerful it could ruin their political career. That explains how other candidates are crowded out. That flips their democratic principle because we get more people running, more people for you to be able to choose from. Let's next go to the second substantive. I'll explain how this gets less voter engagement in the long term. A few reasons this gets less voter engagement. The first one is I think you're incentivized to do more corruption. The way Abrar explains it, there are other ways there's a second way to explain. It is when you believe your family is able to cover it up for you in the future. That means you're more likely to incentivize to do that corruption. It doesn't matter if that's true, but you probably think that you are able to appoint your family to do it in the future. It means you're more incentivized to do corruption. That works in the way that the Marcos has planned to be able to get Bong Bong eventually unelected, and then Imelda had like 2,000 shoes in her store so that she was able to seek out a lot of money from the Philippines because they knew that they could rewrite the narratives in the future and it would be okay. That explains doing more corruption means people think politics works less and they're less likely to engage with that system. The second way this is true is just I think you get more elite politicians rather than working class politicians, so people are most affected by democracy too now. That is true for a few reasons. Firstly, the people from the elite dynasties grew up in sheltered homes, in really sheltered conditions. They've been living protected by bodyguards in the White House their whole life. They've been being protected, and they've been growing up really rich with someone cooking every meal for them. These people never understood what it meant to be like you, so that meant you've got more and more elite politicians. Secondly, I would just say that the scrutiny that they point to, always like when you get scrutiny, you get towards the women, you get literally no scrutiny towards the men. The women are held accountable for the actions of their husbands and their partners, but I doubt that the men in most vast majority of circumstances are never held accountable for this. This explains how the eldest male child is able to get elected, but maybe the wife is not. I said it's even more elite to just have the elite rich white men who are the sons of the leaders. That explains its worth. But I think the third reason that we get there's less engagement in democracy is people just feel like there is less options. When you don't feel like anything fundamentally changes. Maybe it was a Bush one time, maybe it's a Clinton the next time. They're basically just like different versions of the same thing on and over again. Like the names are basically similar when it goes Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Elliot Clinton again. When it goes Marcos Duterte, you just feel like the world doesn't change. And that means you don't think your vote matters. There's no point engaging with democracy if you don't think your vote matters. That means less people vote. That fits their principle because less people engage with democracy. It's a more certain way rather than the subjective, or maybe some people don't get to run for office. We explain less people engage. It means we also get more practical impacts because we have more people, we get better candidates, more people are engaging and they reflect themselves better. That explains more engagement with democracy is able to win us the way. Let's last go into the candidates you choose. they essentially say to you that you're likely to scrutinize me badly for being a nepo baby. All this analysis is, well, you can point to the bad things they did in the past. They can also point to the good things they did in the past. So I'm going to prove to you why you're more likely to romanticize the bad things to be not that bad, and romanticize good things to be really good, which structurally proves how you get an advantage that's unfair and not representative of what happened in the past. 3 ways. Firstly, I would say you're often too powerful and control media narratives by controlling government or allowing the media to exist in many circumstances. Like, as Michael knows, we're not talking about like the strongest democracies. Sorry, Abrar. Well, we're not talking about the strongest democracies. It was Michael's idea, to be clear. The strongest democracies. It's places like Cuba where the Castros are able to rule over and over again, and they control the media and the way that narratives occur. But secondly, is people don't like thinking they made the right choice. Maybe H.W. Bush did go back on no new taxes, but people don't think about that much. They go through and they want to think that they made the correct choice. But thirdly, I'd say that most people, and that's the context we're talking about, are nationalists. They want to support what happened in the past, which is like they over-romanticize the things that happened. They say you're not bound by your parents. Like, I'm kind of bound by my parents to support them. I won't be like my father's a war criminal even if he is. Like, I think people are just kind of bound by that. But also think they have mechanisms over not making you elected. We explain this because in weak democracies, the worst areas, Philippines, Cuba, proud to affirm.
Affirmative makes a really big mistake when they only focus on weak democracies. Because the reality is, in weak democracies, whether or not you allow family members to run for office, they're still going to have political influence. They still have the capacity to elect people like puppet leaders. They still have the capacity to have a voice because they've had so strong of a voice in the past. That means a lot of the harms they give you are broadly symmetric. They're locked out of most of those harms. Where this debate actually takes place is in stronger democracies, in places where there are existing things like checks and balances, in the places where there are things like scrutiny against family members of politicians that makes them feel pressure to be better politicians. That's where the primary impacts in this debate take place. That's where we win. 3 things in the speech. First thing, where does this debate take place? Secondly, on why better politicians get voted in on our side and why the policy is broadly not going to be shit like they tell you. And finally, on how this impacts democracy and people's ability to actually engage with that democracy. Firstly, where does this debate take place? Because the majority of their material actually only applies to things like weak democracies, right? You know the harm is symmetric. Like I explained to you earlier, this debate, like in these weak democracies, there's a high capacity to elect things like puppet leaders. See, like in Russia, where Putin was able to, elect Mendeleev before, coming back into power and, consolidating his power. I know the unique incentive exists to do this because you obviously want to keep consolidating your power. You still want to have influence in these weak democracies. You still want to have power when you've had it for a long time. But secondly, why is it worse in affirmative? Because now it's harder to really call out corruption. Because now when you're able to constantly be changing leaders, have it not associated with a particular person, then it's kind of hard to have a level of accountability for the politician that's actively fucking over these weak democracies. That's incredibly harmful because now you're unable to actually try and shift the landscape of these weak democracies, try to make them more democratic, try to make them more fair. That means it locks them out of every single harm that they tell you. That already locks them out of this debate. They actually need to engage with the material that we have for you on these strong democracies. So let's talk about these strong democracies then. Because they tell you that firstly, you're going to be voting in things like bad politicians because they're credible, because they can hide bad things. But note that this is just so this does not engage with anything that Ollie tells you. 3 reasons. Firstly, note that credibility just makes you running incredibly hard. There's a large growing anti-nepo baby sentiment. Even in just pop culture, people fucking hate really popular celebrities who've had popular parents because they just think that they didn't work for it. They need to work harder in order to feel like they actually deserve this recognition. Secondly, it's just really hard to hide the bad things that you do because there's far higher media coverage on the families of politicians because the public eye is obviously focused on the people that are running their country. So there's a far higher chance that there's going to be things like accountability for doing bad things. It's far harder to sweep things under the rug because people actually care about you instead of you being a nobody who nobody actually knew about before the election. But finally, note that in strong democracies, there are a lot of things like checks and balances. There's enough opposition media. Say if a Democrat wanted to have their child, run for office, obviously Fox News is going to be incredibly critical, or vice versa. So that means that there is it is actually comparatively harder for a lot of these politicians, these family members of politicians, to actually get voted in because they need to do so much more to increase their credibility. The second thing that they tell want to leave down their own legacy. They don't want to be constantly overshadowed by their parents and being like, yeah, this is just a continuation of my dad's policy. Just see me as an extension of my dad instead of my own person. Like, that's just an incredibly destructive mentality. But secondly, learning from family policy looks really good. Like, if your parents made really bad mistakes, and if you continue to perpetuate those mistakes, then firstly, you can't separate yourself from family legacy like I explained to you. But secondly, like, people naturally criticize politicians for being really self-righteous pieces of shit. Like, obviously, in order to avoid that sort of narrative, in order to, like, kind of work past that, you have to learn from a lot of the mistakes that your family made, learn from the mistakes that actively harm people. But the last thing that they tell you it means that the policies that these politicians are implementing aren't actually going to be particularly harmful. They're not going to be complacent. They actually have an incentive to do new things, to implement good policy. But the final thing that they tell you is that, there's an incentive to try and continuously keep your family in power. Firstly, know that there's a contingent on getting into office in the first place, and this already filters out a lot of the unqualified candidates, a lot of the potentially corrupt candidates. So it means that the material's already really fucking shaky. But secondly, it's like they have to actually be overqualified, and you actually have to be incredibly uncorrupt and have a very clean track record, which means that it's very unclear as to why there's going to be things like consolidating power, trying to keep your family in power for generations and generations on end. In fact, if you get into office, it's probably a good thing, because now there's more public scrutiny. It's an incentive to implement better policy, like we explained to you. It's easier to establish things like rapport with people within Parliament or people within the White House, because they somewhat recognize you. Maybe you've worked alongside them before. That just makes making policy so much easier and a far more efficient process, instead of having to establish that relationship with government officials that makes policy so incredibly ineffective. That means that in these that means in a lot of these strong democracies that we just do get better policy, we do get better politicians. This is incredibly important, because this is where the largest change in this debate takes place. Because even if you buy in their best case, there is a minor change in potentially how this operates in weak democracies. Note that the change is at best a very small thing, because people are still scared of changing policy of people who still have influence, and people are still scared of going back on policy from people that still continue to have influence within politics. The change is incredibly minimal. Here, the change is incredibly large. Better policy equals better lives. Finally, on ability to engage with democracy and being democratic, because the first thing that they tell you here is that deterring people from running is really, really harmful, because now you have less choice. And I think that is just so incredibly untrue in strong democracies, because firstly, politicians in a lot of these strong democracies just have an incentive to want to run to push their own political agenda. Like, last time I checked, in 2012, people weren't scared to run against Obama. They still want to, push these, they still want to, advance the country. They still want to implement new policy that specifically supports what they think. That means that their whole thing on, people having no options and people being locked into particular politicians is just so incredibly unrealistic and unintuitive. It's really unclear where that plays into this debate. But the second thing that they tell you is that, picking people to enter office and picking people to, give particular influence is incredibly harmful in these democracies. I just think, firstly, it's incredibly uncompelling, because it is reliant on the fact that people will blindly support a lot of these politicians. And we think that it is really unclear why people are going to blindly support these politicians, especially after every single reason that we've given you from Ollie and earlier in my speech. But the second thing is that I think it is just far less democratic if you pick people from your party to endorse, because they tell you that, it's not democratic if you only have one option. But I think that it is far less democratic if you're likely going to be picking the person that agrees with you the most and the person that's been the most loyal to you throughout your candidacy. It's just because at least, as we literally explained to you, these children of these politicians have an incentive to be different. These new politicians who aren't part of their family don't have an incentive to be different. That means that it is far less democratic, you have far less choice. Finally, on Ollie's principle, because it's a non-contingent principle, this principle exists no matter what. And they try to misconstrue our principle by saying that it is about who can run for office. But no, it's not about that. It's about who you can vote for. It means every single person in the democracy who they're allowed to actually support and who they're actually allowed to, nominate and to support to get into office. Note that this is even worse when these politicians and these candidates are qualified, because now you can't even vote for the qualified candidate. I think that's, again, even more harmful, because you lock people out of qualified politicians and you lock them into less qualified politicians. I think that makes democracies just far less productive and far less democratic. And the final thing that they say here is that term limits are really are something that we commonly support. I just think that's a really uncharitable analogy, because you're obviously not the same person as your parent. It's unclear as to why this principle should apply universally. And I think we just win on how democracy is being, how democracy just actively gets better on our side, how it actively gets destroyed on their side. If you care about people, you should stand with negative.
Second negative makes a big point saying this debate is about weak liberal democracies, weak democracies, because the harms are symmetric. First, I'm going to prove that in many cases it is about weak democracies, but then I'm also going to prove that our case isn't contingent on that. Firstly, why are our harms not symmetric when it comes to weak democracies? Firstly, because this team suffers from a timeline problem. In the case of the Philippines, like most of these weak democracies, were not weak democracies. They became weak democracies because of the familial dynasties that came to control them. For example, the Philippines was a very stable and good democracy until Duterte and Marcos came in and the hegemon caused corruption and a bunch of enforced power dynamics. We prevent democracy from backsliding into these regimes, which is just an incredibly huge benefit that should win us the debate. But secondly, people in weak democracies are just susceptible to these romanticized notions of the past, which are the most easiest to connect to when it comes to familial lines, because there's a very direct, rhetorical and also very clear conceptual link from the father and the son, right? Like the son bringing back the glory days of the father, right? So it's easier for people to understand the romanticized days are coming back when it is a familial one rather than some arbitrary political one. But thirdly, I think by removing the most powerful actor of the dynasty, you allow other actors to compete. So we just get a greater diversity of politicians on your outside, which is just an independent benefit, and it explains to you why these weak democracies do get better, because there is more of a plurality of ideas, there exists greater competition when it comes to politics. But also, second negative tries to say it actually makes it harder to call out, because it actually makes it harder to call out corruption because the link isn't as clear. Firstly, you can still call out the party, for corruption, unclear why that is an option. But secondly, we don't have to call out. We prove that you're structurally more likely to be corrupt in the first place, which avoids the harm of corruption in the first place without having to call out, right? So our arguments are just better because it's we avoid the harm in the first place, right? And that harm being corruption. Okay, but also I don't think we have to win on weak democracies, because as Will explains to you, very little response. We just think that on our side, we just simply get more voter engagement. Because voters, regardless of whether you believe this or not yourselves, voters simply perceive there is more choice to them, right? Because it isn't in the United States, it isn't like the Clintons and the Clintons Bush, right? They actually see that they have a diversity of candidates they can choose from, which increases buy into the political system, which is which sort of outframes the democracy clash, because more people buy into the system of democracy in the first place, which is incredibly important. It is incredibly important for making people feel that they're democratically represented, into getting people to buy into policies and actually see the news, right? Because all their arguments about news scrutiny rely on the fact that people read the news. Many people don't read the news because they feel incredibly disengaged because it is so back and forth, Clinton, Bush, etc. So this argument explains to you why we get all the benefits of democracy that they don't claim, right? Okay, but why do we say we get more engagement? First, because there's less corruption, or at least a perception of corruption. Secondly, because there's less elite politicians, so people feel more resonant or relatable to these politicians. And thirdly, because people feel like there's an actual choice in these elections, so they think about who they vote for rather than tuning out the news. So on that alone, we win the debate. Okay, the first question I'm going to ask is about democracy, right? Because they say, oh, people make stupid decisions all the time. Yeah, fine. They make some people make decisions on uninformed, or little information. That isn't a reason to explain why we should go more that way. It's in fact a reason why we should give people the best information, the best choices. This isn't an argument, right? But also, I think, as Will points out, that we restrict democracy all the time for perfectly valid reasons. This is an extension of things like term limits, etc. No response to that. Okay, so clearly on the issue of democracy, they cannot get their point across. But we clearly win on democracy because of the pre-selection mechanism that goes unresponded to by this team, because of the fact that we get increased voter engagement, which is a prerequisite for all the democracy claims that either team can claim. We get more people to buy into democracy. That is debate winning. Then I'm going to talk about the second question I'm going to ask is about policies and scrutiny, right? Because their claim is that basically candidates get more scrutiny because they have this pressure to they feel this pressure to sort of go above and beyond their previous candidate, their previous familial candidate. Firstly, as Will explains, you're more likely to rely on old policies for a couple of reasons, your old father's policies for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because people often romanticize the past, and I think this is a very, very human instinct, right? We try to block out the worst memories of our life, and I think this is generally true also political histories, right? We try to romanticize the past. So many people in the United States look back on the eras of the 80s or whatever and be like, yes, this was a good time when the government wasn't a huge huge debt, etc. Right? But secondly, I think that is a comparative advantage. No other politician who you're running against in pre-selection has that crux of a familial and stable bloodline in politics, right? That is what to focus on because that is a comparative advantage. But also thirdly, I think like most of these politicians are like right-wing or conservative politicians, and the structural reason for this is because they're like are the ones who are like most wealthy, are the ones with the most connections, and this means that they're more structurally like predisposed to old policies that preserve the status quo, not the progressive policies that try to change the status quo, right? So because structurally these politicians are likely to be right-wing, that explains why that isn't true. But also the second response to this argument about scrutiny is that it is deeply uncomparative. It's unclear why, like maybe there are some cases in which you believe these politicians try to like differentiate themselves from their father, but it's unclear why the comparative is like so much worse. Like the comparative is just like politicians don't have to like politicians don't have any familial links, right? But they still obviously have a need to differentiate themselves from previous prime ministers or previous politicians because they want to get elected, right? It seems like the scrutiny argument is a very defensive one. It is trying to mitigate our harm, but the scrutiny argument doesn't come close to actually proving to why politicians get better, right? Because under our side, politicians don't have this familial or corrupt connection. That means that means that there is scrutiny. This scrutiny argument could never be debate winning on its own. But also, thirdly, as Will notes, the media landscape in many cases is not free or open, which is a prerequisite to you believing this argument about scrutiny. But fourthly, I think this assumes people engage deeply and meaningfully in like very balanced media discourse or media discourse at all. Most people in the United States don't read the news that thoroughly. Even if they do, it is partisan and it is bad and it is uninformed, unclear why they get good information. But sixthly, I think this argument doesn't touch our mechanism about how politicians with a familial connection have a huge and unjustified and apparent advantage in things like pre-selection, right? Because maybe these politicians do get some scrutiny, but this does not get over the fact that these politicians were able to get there in the first place because of their unjustified advantage in pre-selection, and that is a big harm that you should care about, because it crowded out other politicians with diverse views, with actual policy ideas that could not see the light of day because they took their spot unjustifiably. This argument cannot stand. Okay, they say that politicians are bound to what their parents are doing. Not like aren't bound to what their parents did, but like yes, they are clearly bound, right? Because firstly, there are often like familial consequences to going against your father, right? Your family probably controls your estate, your trust, etc. But secondly, I'll note that if you go against your father, that is just like suicide for you, right? Like political suicide. It means your father goes out in the media and like disowns you publicly or like divides his followers. Like that is terrible for you politically, right? So there are a bunch of political and economic and personal reasons, right? Like you probably like your father because he got you that job in the first place, right? There are a bunch of incentives that you want to go against your father, and instead you just do a repeat and a 2.0 of their policies, which is incredibly bad, right? But their arguments simply do not touch our myriad of reasons why corruption is just structurally overwhelmingly likely. Maybe scrutiny gets rid of some of the instances, but they cannot obviously catch all of the instances corruption gives you. Note the examples that Will and Abrar give you. This is an empirical fact, and every time corruption happens, a wealth of harms open up for our team. Because firstly, a huge principle violation occurs at the point at which public funds are squirred away from like the public welfare towards politicians' own pocket. That is devastating. But secondly, I'll note that policy obviously gets much worse at the point at which you get less money for government programs towards people. Okay, the last question I'm going to ask is about the quality of politicians, because they try to state their case here. I think because like they say, oh, you need expertise, especially in developing countries. I think this argument makes a deeply classist assumption about the fact that you need educational or economic privilege to be a good politician. No, you do not, guys. Like most of the politicians outsource their bureaucratic work to like bureaucrats, unelected officials, right? These politicians, what makes a good politician isn't about having experience or connection. That makes you a bad politician because you're predisposed to corruption, right? What makes you a good politician is to be relatable, to understand the plight of the common people, which these people do not, right? For those reasons, clear position win.